ladies and gentlemen, if we could make a start for this final session, which has put you, but particularly me, in an invidious position, because previous sessions 1 and 2 were neat. One was islands, mainly the Atlantic or the Pacific. The last one was East Africa, 3 territories which at one time looks as if they might come together in some form. But here we've got Nigeria, Nyasaland and Malawi and Northern Rhodesia and Zambia all together, and I've got to try and make sense of that, and therefore I won't try to. But we've got 4 speakers, 2 on Nigeria and 2 who are going to talk about Central Africa. Now these of course are very different territories. Nigeria, the most populous territory in Africa, even during the colonial period. A country which has a very different north from the south. Now those differences are replicated in other parts of Central Africa, but perhaps Malawi has a little bit of it. It doesn't have that serious modern fault line between Islam and Christianity, which and variations on those 2 world religious themes that runs through central Nigeria. A place like Malawi exports labour, still exports labour, whereas Nigeria had an export industry based on things like cotton from the north, palm oil, and subsequently oil, which was discovered during the British colonial period. Northern Rhodesia had, of course, copper and received migrants from Malawi. So we're talking about territories which are markedly different. I'm going to ask the speakers to speak for 10 to 15 minutes. I shall be draconian in my control, but as previous sessions have set such a model, they wouldn't dare deviate. Those high standards of probity, which of course underwrote the service that most of you served in. So I'm going to ask John Smith to speak first. And John has got the great advantage of being on the ground in Nigeria and seeing some of the things that I wish I had been there to see with him, but also serving elsewhere in the declining empire, particularly in the Pacific. So John, thank you.
Thank you, David. I went to Nigeria as a cadet at the start of the 50s, the start of the decade of preparation for independence. I went there knowing we were preparing for independence. Discussion of governance and constitutional change was the substance of every village meeting, day after day, week after week, year after year, as I toured my district. And as each constitutional change came, there would be an election in which I took part and would have been involved in training, in organisation, and usually with a direct duty. Even when I was private secretary to the governor at the time of the 1959 pre-independence election, I found myself as returning officer for Kaduna, the capital of the northern region. I don't recall that we ever questioned the Westminster Model. It was what we had grown up with and what we thought we knew. We still, in the 50s, saw Britain as a world power, the leading parliamentary democracy in the world, and Westminster the mother of parliaments. That was our view, I think, pretty generally, and I believe it was pretty generally the view of educated West Africans at that time. When Ghana became independent in 1957, leading the way in Africa, anything other than the Westminster Model, complete with speaker in full bottom wig being processing into the chamber, preceded by a mace bearer, anything other than that would have been seen as second class and insulting. And I think that's an important factor to remember. Indeed, I would suggest that Ghana's independence constitution is as close to a written constitution as Britain has never had. Well worth looking into. Make a great PhD study, in my view. We may not have questioned the model, but we certainly tampered with it occasionally, mainly with the electoral process. In northern Nigeria, the first elections in 1951 were indirect. Suffrage was limited to adult males. There was no electoral register. The ballot at the lowest level was not secret. It was conducted by a show of hands in most places, using the procedure with which people were familiar in electing their village heads. There was also an injection of nominated candidates into the final electoral college in order to ensure that there were some members with some education. Most of these people would have been government or local government servants and would not therefore have been eligible to stand as candidates. Electoral procedures became more sophisticated as we moved along the years towards independence, but they always had to cater for a predominantly illiterate society, and I think that's something everyone should realise when these elections are criticised. Once the legislature was elected, as I heard Tom Russell say this morning, Erskine May took control and procedures followed Westminster. It was all very familiar. The constitutional trail to independence was exciting and a stimulating time, and I shared in a widespread conspiracy of optimism, brushing aside the concerns of some of my elders that it was all happening too soon and too fast. I knew that it had taken Britain centuries to reach where we were, that female suffrage had only arrived within my own lifetime. But when you're young, 10 years seems a very long time, and I felt pretty confident that in that 10 years, with the talent that so many Nigerians expressed, and with our experience to guide them, they would learn the ropes quickly enough and adequately enough. Now, with hindsight, I would still not question the timetable. I think we went when we needed to go. What I would wish is that we had begun that timetable, despite the war, at least 10 years sooner, particularly with respect to education and to the liberalisation of local government. That might have given the Westminster Model a better chance to put down roots, but it would still have been into very shallow soil that was just about ready for Magna Carta, if one is honest. We were very naive. We failed to appreciate how sophisticated a concept it is to govern with an opposition. This has arisen in discussion this morning. It is extremely sophisticated. I think we walked into it without thinking about that. In the Northern House of Assembly, it was discourteous to, other than sing the praises of the Premier, in the tradition of the Emirates. Opposition members who did not of their own volition cross the floor were courted, at first in a friendly fashion. But it was not long before opposition was deemed not merely discourteous, but disloyal. And then, as loyalty became more and more sycophantic, it became an insult to stand in an election against the leader who had won independence. After independence, it became a matter of honour, however dishonourable the method, to ensure that all members of the ruling party were returned unopposed. And those who criticise British conduct of elections should take note that that is when elections really began to be rigged in Nigeria. It didn't require much of a leap for disloyalty to become treason. Within the legislature itself, although the procedures remained unchanged, business was sped through, and a parliamentary session might last no more than a day, in which several bills would be transacted through all three readings and committee stage. Why waste on time on debate when all are agreed? These changes in Westminster style, if not in substance, happened well before Nigeria's first coup, which took place on the 15th of January 1966, just 5 years after independence. Should we be surprised? However sound and widespread the preparation, and however successful the model had been elsewhere, it was not in itself strong enough to overcome deeply entrenched cultural features. We are governed by indirect rule, reinforcing indigenous systems of governance, as someone's already raised today, sometimes exaggerating the extent of chiefly authority, influenced by our own history. In the dominant chiefly societies of northern Nigeria, a colonial governor was an easily recognizable figure. But he was an autocratic Tudor monarch, not a constitutional Queen Elizabeth II. Again, a point somebody has made. He didn't have to consult or accept advice until the very end. The checks on and balances on his authority were largely hidden. And here's a point that I don't think many people make, but he was often assumed to exercise among the expatriate community the same networks of obligation and dependency common to virtually every Nigerian people. Indirect rule also did nothing to assist the development of nationality. While we could draft a constitution that apparently took care of it all, a mere 60 years of British rule was insufficient for that. Independence became an aspiration that provided a shimmer of unity, but there were huge disparities between the regions of Nigeria, and the dominant political parties inevitably became regionally based. It was not so much a question of dividing and ruling, but as of ruling over divisions whose strengths we failed to recognize. We were expecting the impossible. Speaking of tribalism as though it was a little local difficulty, when we were dealing with peoples as numerous and as distinct as Finn and Greek, or Pole and Spaniard. Once independence was achieved, not only were those to whom power had been transferred heroes, but everyone wanted a place in the sun. Something confrontational Westminster doesn't do, although Cameron's trying it at the moment. It proved as impossible to achieve the necessary national government as it was to work with an opposition. Our 18th century ancestors would have better understood the needs of patriarchal societies in which patronage and obligation play a major role. That Nigeria may at last, very slowly, be edging its way towards a more representative and democratic form of government is less to the credit of the Westminster Model than to the remarkably lively and free press that the British tolerated and which has survived, to the BBC World Service that has sustained standards of impartial reporting long since lost to the home services in this country, and to the huge boost given to communication, first by the transistor radio, and more recently by the internet and mobile phone.
Thank you, John. Now, another view of Nigeria, one which was on the ground, but also from London. Sir Brian Barber. So, Brian, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I had three periods of involvement with Nigeria, some years apart, and each in a completely different role. When I joined the Home Civil Service, not the Home Service, but the Home Civil Service, and joined the Colonial Office in 1957, long before training had been invented in Britain, My first job was to sit at a desk with a large pile of classified files in black pouches and told to get on with them, and they were all about Nigeria. And I was dealing with the run-up to independence. I was there very soon after the 1957 Constitutional Conference, and I was on the Secretariat of the junior member of the Secretariat of the 1958 Constitutional Conference, and I was heavily involved in the drafting and negotiation being really more important than the drafting of the independence Constitution. So I saw it at close quarters, but at very long quarters, because I was in London throughout. 8 years later, I was, by this time I'd gone down the Rake's progress and become a diplomat, and I was back in London, and this time in the Foreign Office, dealing with Nigeria at the time of Biafra, which was, one forgets now, an enormous political hot potato for Harold Wilson and the British government. So that was a busy time, and then I suppose 18 years later I actually managed to get to Nigeria as British High Commissioner, but that's not really relevant to what we're discussing today. So the constitutional conferences and the writing of the final independence constitution were really the culmination of a very long process that began, I suppose, really in 1914, when the parts of Nigeria were amalgamated into a single territory. And after that, there were 4 major constitutions. The first 2 were really pretty well imposed on Nigeria without much local consultation. Constitutions in 1922 and 1946. The 1946 one was important because it established the 3 regions which remained pretty much untouched until well after independence, or soon after independence anyway. Followed by 2 constitutions, the Macpherson Constitution in 1951 and the Littleton Constitution in 1954, leading up to the 1957-1958 constitutions, which led to independence. Those last 2 constitutions in the early 1950s, and certainly the 1957-1958 constitutions, were literally negotiated with the Nigerian leaders. I, as I said, turned into a diplomat later. In fact, I learned my first beginnings of diplomacy in the Colonial Office. We were not dictating the terms of those constitutions. The Nigerians, we were struggling to reconcile the views of all the different Nigerians, and also to try and fulfill our responsibilities to those in Nigeria who were literally scared of what would happen to them when the British withdrew. And these were in 2 categories, really. There was the northern region, which was more affected by the Lugard doctrine of indirect rule and the dual mandate than the other 2 regions, although it applied to all of them to some extent. But Lugard had found a functioning Islamic system with emirs and sheikhs and the rest of it, and in many ways very responsibly and in a very liberal spirit, saw no reason particularly to interfere with that. And of course he was egged on by the traditional meanness of the British Treasury to use what he found rather than attempt to superimpose an expensive British system on top of it. So the northern region went on being governed pretty much as it always had been for centuries. The result was that the northern region, I'm afraid, became further and further behind. It was less exposed to Western influences. Islam was the dominant feature, and they were increasingly overtaken by the 2 southern regions, the eastern region and the western region. So the northerners were very nervous indeed about independence. They felt that with the British removed, they were in danger of being dominated by the smart Alex and the smart politicians of the Western region, the Eastern region, many of whom who had been to American universities, somebody mentioned earlier, that they had quite a strong influence on some of these local politicians. And it was from the South that the real driving force for independence came. The other groups who were very nervous about independence were the minorities within each region. And in the Colonial Office, we had a genuine sense of responsibility towards them. They were really scared that the majority groups in each region would dominate them and exploit them, that their lives had become impossible. That had been prevented while Britain was still even nominally in charge towards the end. So something had to be done about that, and those who were involved at the time will remember we set up the Willing Commission to look into the rights of minorities and how they could be protected after independence. And Willing came up with some interesting ideas. They were seen, the draft report was seen by my immediate boss, whom I won't name, but a very, very capable principal, who was absolutely, took the draft report home and came back absolutely aghast and rewrote it. It was then published more or less as he wrote it. And that did in fact produce some useful measures which helped to a degree to allay the fears and suspicions of the minorities. But of course that still left the different attitudes to independence and the speed of independence between the northern region on one hand, with the great Muslim leaders, the Emir of Kano, and the Sultan of Sokoto, who was your boss, I think it was, who were very reluctant to move at the speed demanded by the southern leaders like Zig and Awolowo and cohorts. So federalism was the answer to this multiple ambition as to speed and the caution of the northern region and of the minorities. So the federal constitution was agreed by the Nigerians themselves as the absolutely essential format of the constitution that could be made to work, so that the three regions could proceed at different speeds, although of course in the end they all had to agree on a date for independence. And the date for independence was repeatedly postponed to take account of northern fears, but eventually they were persuaded to agree on October 1960. One of the main measures that we tried to apply in the Constitution to satisfy fears was an extensive chapter of human rights in the Constitution, something that Britain only came to rather a lot later. It was, of course, after the establishment of the European Convention on Human Rights, but not long after. And I was heavily involved in drafting that. And it's quite interesting to look at the section headings of the relevant chapter of the Independence Constitution. It's remarkably comprehensive, though I said shouldn't have. Deprivation of life, inhuman treatment, slavery and forced labour, deprivation of personal liberty, determination of rights, private and family life, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, freedom of movement, freedom from discrimination, derogations from fundamental rights, reference to tribunal in certain cases, compulsory acquisition of property. It all rings extremely familiar now that we're all arguing away about the Human Rights Act. We didn't seriously consider an alternative to the Westminster Model for the reasons that John and others have given, and that the Nigerians would have regarded it as insulting if we'd suggested anything radically different. It was only 10, 12 years after the end of the war. We all thought our system was the best in the world. We fought a bitter war to preserve it. We fought a war to preserve our right to govern ourselves, even if we did it worse than the Germans. We had signed up to the Untitled Chapter. Certainly the younger members of the Colonial Office at the time, as I think Ian Hughes will agree, didn't believe in ruling other people against their will. So there was a real motivation in the Colonial Office to grant self-determination and independence to those territories that really wanted it, and the demand for it in countries like Nigeria created a momentum that it would have been absolutely fatal to try and resist.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Professor Colin Baker, who started, well, he didn't start his life there, but he started his working life there, I think, in Iceland in the colonial service, but he's written a good number of books on both Iceland and the Central African question. So, Colin, thank you very much.
Thank you. I served in the Colonial Service Administration in Iceland, which became Malawi from 1954 to
64.
Absolutely right. Let me start again. 1954 to 1971. During that time, I was variously district commissioner, under secretary in the Colonial Office, in the Cabinet Office, and director of the University of Malawi's Institute of Public Administration. We left Malawi in 1971 and then spent 3 years at the University of Ife, Nigeria, also as director of the Institute of Administration there. In 1974 we returned to Britain, and I joined the staff of what became the University of Glamorgan, where I currently am Professor Emeritus, Honorary Fellow and Research Professor. In the middle of all this was one fascinating period of 3 months, which I'm sorry we haven't been able to deal with today, and that was as a member of the Election Commission in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, in 1980. Someday perhaps we should have a look at that. However, Westminster and Malawi. As a preliminary point, I shall try to avoid the use of the word model. This is because in addition to being a system or a pattern, the word also means a paragon, a figure of supreme excellence, worthy of ubiquitous emulation. It seems that we ourselves don't see Westminster as a paragon, otherwise we wouldn't go on tinkering with it in the way we have done and still are doing. Even more clearly, the majority of other countries in the world don't see the Westminster system as a paragon worth emulating. Of the nearly 200 sovereign states in the world, fewer than 3 dozen can be said to follow the Westminster pattern, and none of those is in Nigeria. So what of the Westminster system and Malawi in the era of decolonisation? An essential characteristic of the Westminster system is the existence of an officially recognised opposition, the functions of which are to hold the executive in check and to provide an alternative government. Now, the very idea of having an opposition which is officially fostered and paid to oppose the government was the source of much mirth in Malawi. Murder, arson, other serious forms of intimidation in the 3 years before independence ensured that the country was already de facto a one-party state and became de jure a one-party state soon after independence. There were representatives in the legislature, but they represented the Malawi Congress Party and not the people. Another salient characteristic of the Westminster system is that its legislature is bicameral. The functions of the second chamber being to relieve the first chamber of some of the burden of work, to act as a check and a restraint, and to provide the opportunity and time for reflection. Malawi is unicameral and consequently does not benefit from those democratic safeguards. If the independence constitution had provided a second chamber, it is very likely that it would have been very quickly abolished, but it might have been worth trying. The Westminster distinction between the role of the head of government and the role of the head of state was rejected in Malawi in the Republican Constitution 2 years after independence, when the posts of Prime Minister and Governor General were done away with and replaced by an executive life president. That would have happened earlier if the Prime Minister had not used the Governor General actively to bolster his own personal regime and to carry out executive functions on his behalf. The personal regime needed bolstering, and the executive functions needed delegating, because all the ministers except one either resigned or was sacked within a few weeks of independence. Under those circumstances, the Governor-General was by no means simply a figurehead. Indeed, Sir Glyn Jones acted much more like a governor in the 2 years after independence than he had in the 3 years before independence. The Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland retarded political progress in Malawi during the decade before independence. Although significant steps were taken for political advance after Dr. Banda returned to Malawi in 1958, the constraints of the Federation were not lifted until only 6 months before independence. By that time, of course, much valuable time had been lost, and there was very little time left to foster the development of democratic government. In any case, we had been climbing the local government tree rather than the central government tree to reach the early fruits of democratic government. At the centre, the first Malawian members of Executive Council were not appointed until only 5 years before independence. And even then they were nominated and represented no political parties. And the first parliamentary elections with universal adult suffrage were not held until 3 years before independence, which was a very short period of time. The Westminster system, it seems to me, requires a number of supporting institutions if it is to function satisfactorily. These include a permanent non-political civil service, a constabulary which is free of central control, and an independent judiciary. So the civil service can be loyal to the government of the day. The constabulary can carry out its functions of preserving the peace and maintaining law and order without political interference. And the judiciary can be a place to which the citizen can turn for protection and for redress against the illegal acts of his neighbour and of the government. So far as the non-political civil service is concerned, there was, of course, both before and after independence, a good deal of party intervention in appointments, promotions, and dismissals. But in the crucial case of the administration, the best possible candidates were selected, and selected on non-political criteria. And they turned out to be remarkable men, reaching the very top of the civil service and serving it faithfully and with competence, both at home and abroad. There's just one more point about a non-political civil service. The chairman of the Public Service Commission, this is 2 years before independence, the chairman of the Public Service Commission was sufficiently troubled by being bypassed by ministers that he did not seek to have his contract renewed. He talked to the governor about this a number of times, but received little sympathy and no support. Since he was also Speaker of the National Assembly, his departure from the country had implications for the proper conduct of parliamentary affairs. Concerning a constabulary which is independent of central control. In Britain, the constable has a common law right and duty, which is personal to himself or herself, to preserve the peace and maintain law and order. Constables are officers of the law, they are not officers of the government. Now, in Malawi, before independence, I do not recall that position being questioned. But I do know that in Kenya, in the 1950s, the Chief Secretary, backed by the Governor, was adamant that the police should always be subject to the authority of the police. Indeed, so adamant was he that he bullied the Commissioner of Police and the Attorney General until they could tolerate it no longer and they left the country. And what about an independent judiciary? Somewhat surprisingly, I think, for the first 6 years of independence, the judiciary was largely independent. It is true that the Malawian lay magistrates were personally selected, appointed and deployed by the president, who of course also was the life president of the Malawi Congress Party. But it wasn't until 1970 that the High Court was seriously affected. Angered by one of the judges who found no case to answer in a politically sensitive trial, the President introduced legislation which placed murder and other serious trials in the hands of untrained, traditional, customary courts. At this point, the judges felt that they could no longer remain at the head of a judicial system with those provisions. And the whole of the High Court bench left office. The judges were keen not to bring about a crisis, and keen also not to give the impression that they were deliberately raising a public and high-profile protest. So they left office individually over a shortish period of time on early retirement in complete agreement with the government. So let me see if I can briefly deal with the four questions I was asked to address today. To what extent was the Westminster Model considered suitable for British dependencies? Answer: entirely suitable, but utterly unachievable in view of the steps we had taken and had not taken in the preceding years. Question 2. What other forms of representative government were considered in the run-up to independence? Answer: none. 3. How effective and durable were the democratic structures inherited by newly independent governments? Answer, neither effective nor durable. 4, what attempts were made to adjust the institutions in the aftermath of independence? Answer, none taken to adjust the arrangements. Malawi preferred to tackle the roots and branches of its constitution and not prune the twigs and not rearrange the leaves.
Thank you, Colin, for another measured contribution. Our final speaker is Dr. Jonathan Lawley, who served in Northern Rhodesia. So, Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you, David. I went to Southern Rhodesia when I was 12 years old to join my parents, ex-India, and I was sent to school in Southern Rhodesia and in South Africa. And my reaction to what I saw and experienced and lived in that part of the world made me feel that I really didn't want any part of it. I was lucky enough to be accepted for the colonial service, and in 1959 sent on the Devonshire course to Cambridge. I came out to Northern Rhodesia in the middle of 1960, and I loved it right from the word go. For the first time in my life, I found myself talking to black people on equal terms. I hadn't done it ever in South Africa and or Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia. Anyway, to what extent was the Westminster Model of democracy considered suitable for British dependencies? To my recollection, nothing else was ever considered. We always said that one man, one vote was what we believed in and what was the best. For us, the administration, the key questions were about timing and implementation. The nationalist just wanted us to practice what we preached and, of course, deliver immediately. Our difficulty was moving away too quickly from indirect rule and a system which had hitherto worked and brought stability. Up to 1962 in Northern Rhodesia, consultation at national level had been with a largely nominated white legislative council of government officials and settlers, with a few local chiefs. Implied government policy over the years had always been gradual movement towards universal adult suffrage. LegCo, as it was called, would be adapted to accommodate more and more elected members. At district level, consultation was with the chiefs through the native authorities. For us in the provincial administration, the culture was the welfare of the people under the established principle of the paramountcy of African interests, something mentioned by somebody earlier on today. In 1960, one man, one vote democracy was not a realistic short-term prospect. However, indications of our recognition of the importance of public opinion comes from the priority we gave to contact with the people through village-to-village touring and through the district messenger system. The latter involved a trusted band of men in every district whose job was to take the administration's message to the people and reflect public opinion back to us. Generally, the chiefs trusted the DC to tell them what was best, and the fact that the latter remained silent over the big issue of the time, that of federation with Southern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, caused the former to conclude that there was something the matter with federation, and there probably was. It was a major issue that spurred the nationalists. My assumption in 1960 was that one man, one vote leading to independence would not come for another 10 to 15 years. No preparations for its implementation were being made. An understanding of the way it operates, and particularly the importance of tolerance of the other man's viewpoint, were not yet part of local culture. For this, practice and experience of such a system would have been necessary. presumably starting with local government elections and moving on to national elections. And here I think I beat everybody in this one. In the event, the first local government elections were held in January 1964, the year of independence. The first national one man, one vote elections had been held just over a year before. Logically, policies aimed at speeding up the country's preparation for democracy and independence should have followed Macmillan's Wind of Change speech in 1960, but there was little or no change on the ground after that. By 1962, however, increased political activity, resulting partly from the British government giving nationalists the impression that they were pushing at an open door. Things really started to change very fast. The nationalists concluded that they needed to assert themselves over the opposition party as quickly as possible. The British media interpreted the resulting inter-party violence, particularly on the Commonwealth, as a struggle against colonial oppression. Besides coping with this and some turbulence in the north and in the big Commonwealth towns, the Northern Rhodesia government was preoccupied with the possibility of destabilization in other rural areas through intimidation by political activists. Hence, the government propaganda campaign to persuade people that their vote would be secret. In Tonga, I remember, I voteremo maseseke. I remember being drafted into the campaign in a neighbouring rural district because of my fluency in the local Tonga language. The methodology was a cowboy film to pull in the crowds, followed by a propaganda film about an upstanding citizen who had a picture of the Queen on the wall. I remember his name was Lazarus Pemtonia, with an accompanying ditty about the secrecy of the vote. Excuse me bursting into song, but it's appropriate, I think. Oh, listen to me, please take this matter seriously. In October we hold elections, yes, we are going in the right direction. Oh, listen to me, we have our problems, 1, 2, 3. All this talk of intimidation is giving us a bad reputation. Anyway, we on balance, we in the provincial administration thought we were going in the right direction, even if it was too fast and rather sudden. The suspicion was that HMG, which had hitherto been moving so slowly, now wanted to get out with little thought for the consequences and would not be diverted. Whether or not the new one-man, one-vote constitution was suitable, by mid-1962 there was no turning back. I was transferred to the Commonwealth and witnessed the politics of violence and intimidation perpetuated by the main independence party, Kenneth Kaunda's unit. Politics was all about inter-party violence, of which I witnessed a good deal before the incredibly peaceful October 1962 elections. A little over a year later came the first local government elections in a northern district where support for UNIP was solid. There, the only people who dared to oppose the party were members of the Jehovah's Witness sect and Alice Lenshina's Lumpa Church. And I found myself with 30 of the former, the former Jehovah's Witness people, men, women and children in the Inchilengi prison on Lake Mweru, who had been sent to me because they'd refused to pay a fine and therefore had to be sent to prison for defying a new UNIP local law against house-to-house preaching. This was 6 months before independence. I managed to get the governor to declare the law unconstitutional. I wonder what the British press would have said if they'd really got hold of that one. Maybe they wouldn't have been interested. As far as they were concerned, we were just the colonial oppressors. Meanwhile, the offending local authority members, having promised to end all taxes, were refusing to pass a budget, while simultaneously voting themselves vast new allowances. They admitted to a visiting government official in my presence that their priority was money for themselves. At that point, anyone doubted the suitability of the democratic system would have had good grounds. Hitherto loyal African civil servants could not be persuaded that we were not giving way to the forces of evil. In fact, the predominant dynamic was HMG's wish to speed up its departure from Africa. In the face of this, I think we can take credit for continuing to nurture the idea that the views of the individual were important. As regards what other forms of representative government were considered in the run-up to independence, I knew of none. Theoretically, the federation with white-dominated southern Rhodesia could have persisted, but that was never a runner, particularly as it implied no future for northern Rhodesia as an independent country. As regards effectiveness and durability of democratic structures, I'm convinced of the basic good sense of ordinary people, whether educated or not. In northern Rhodesia, we were propelled towards independence by a second dynamic spawned by the first. This was a populace seduced by promises of material gain it had been promised by the politicians. At independence, the durability of democratic structures was untested. At first, politicians were inclined to say democracy was an alien concept. Even the idea of MPs representing the people who elected them was not fully understood. I remember talking to Kaunda about this, and he said it would take quite a lot of time. I remember the voters of the Zambezi Valley constituency, fed up with broken promises of the two nationalist parties, electing an independent white European politician, Hugh Midgley, in 1967. However, in the post-independence years in Zambia, I remember, and I spent 5 years there after independence, I remember no priority being given to changing the inherited constitution. In the event, it seems to me, most Africans, most Zambians anyway, have come round to democracy and generally not only value it, but in my experience, have come to operate it pretty well. This reflects the great African strength, the ability to learn quickly, to adapt and to change. People have come to see democracy as far preferable to the greedy, power-hungry dictators with no priority beyond retaining personal power. I think we colonial administrators deserve credit for our persistence over the implementation of what we believed in. Clearly, we were trusted, and I don't think election results have ever been questioned in post-independence Zambia. 6 years after independence, Kaunda appointed an ex-district officer, Malcolm Mitchell, still in the country, as Director of Elections. I want to end by mentioning the Rhodesia-Zimbabwe independence elections, 1980, which was effectively the last act of the colonial service, with former district officers, mainly ex-Northern Rhodesia, but there were Kenyans, Swazi, and Malawian ex-DOs there as well, being pulled out of retirement to supervise it in the rural areas. The exercise, of which Britain and all concerned can be very proud, resulted from the Lancaster House Agreement, and it brought almost instant peace to the new state, and it set it on a new democratic path towards freedom and democracy and prosperity. It is a tragedy that the people of Zimbabwe, with their sophisticated and deep appreciation of the merits of democracy for which they had to fight, are now once again being denied it.
Thank you, Jonathan. We've got 5 minutes, and David Le Breton has asked if he can read a brief 5-minute paper on Nyasaland, which is from whom, David?
From Gordon Landreth.
Oh yes, Gordon.
He was the district commissioner in Karonga in the north of Nyasaland.
Right.
And he said he's very sorry he couldn't be here today, but will he be allowed to make this statement? So he says he was administrative officer in Nyasaland 1950 to 1964. Although I'm unable to attend the seminar, I offer the following brief comments. I served in the district administration as an ADC in Blantyre and Chida Zulu, 1950 to 53, in the secretariat in Zomba as an assistant secretary, 54 to 56, in the northern province as the PC's assistant, 1957, and as DC Karonga, 1958 to 59. Then in Zomba as information officer, that's the liaison with Special Branch, 1960, and acting secretary to the governor, 1960, finally as senior section officer in the Ministry of Natural Resources, and then the Ministry of Transport and Communications, 1961-64. He wanted me to tell you that in his background. So what he says is, in the district administration, we worked on the principle of indirect rule, merely checking that the decisions in the native authority courts were reasonable and confining ourselves to poll tax collection and general advice on government policy as applied locally. We encouraged African civil servants to develop their skills and occasionally discussed Western ideas of democracy, but we applied the paternalist system of government that we had inherited. At the time of the Central African Federation, we had great difficulty in persuading the local leaders that the federal scheme was not one to hand power to the settlers in southern Rhodesia. And we failed in persuading them and faced the consequences in the disturbances in 1959, which led to a riot in Karonga while I was the district commissioner there. When I visited the district in 1988, I discovered one man who was involved as a young man in the riot, and he said he bore me no resentment, and he felt that the rioters did not really know what they were doing. In the Secretariat, we developed a pattern of ministries on the Westminster Model, but with civil servants in charge. When internal self-government was introduced in the 1960s, some leaders in the Congress Party became ministers, and we saw a development of the Westminster Model, though civil servants kept the role of ministers in some key departments. Dr. Banda, as the Congress leader, was a very individualist minister in the Ministry of Natural Resources, under whom I served for a short time. And we know that soon afterwards, when full independence was granted, his rule swiftly became dictatorial. I conclude that while we handed on the outward forms of Western democracy, we hardly achieved the aim of government of the people by the people.
Thank you very much. We could have several themes that come out of this, and I just picked one or two, and let me just mention them before we ask questions and make comments. One or two of the speakers talked about the haste in getting independence. In fact, not haste. Their emphasis was, if only it had been earlier. And yet, of course, history was against that, both in terms of the economic terms of the metropole, the depression of the 1930s, but just the mindset of the 1920s and the 30s, which did not see Africa as being independent for many, many centuries, not just decades. A second thing that has come out of what has been said is localized, local meaning large scale, resistance to what was seen as premature independence in northern Nigeria, but also in Ashanti and the northern territories of the Gold Coast, but in the Protectorate of Sierra Leone, and in other parts of Africa where you had ethnic groups or interest groups who said, we do not want independence on those terms. And this leads to local political rivalries. It's not merely anti-colonial politics that we talk about in this period of Africa, it's also about African politics. I come back to what I said earlier about politics meaning lots of very, very different things. The third thing which has been referred to was the Public Service Commission. My recollection of spending a good number of possibly years in what is now the National Archives at Kew is that a lot of the correspondence on this latter period leading up to decolonisation is concerned with public service commissions. I don't know that many scholars have actually worked on it. It seems to me to demand a particular mindset and knowledge to actually grapple with the stuff. But clearly it's important that people were talking about what are we going to hand over and on what terms. Who's going to control the police? Will there be an independent civil service? And how can we guarantee it? And the high standards of probity which existed in the colonial service in the 40s and the 50s to be put into good hands? Well, were there the good hands to put them in? How would this be done? The fourth topic which is being looked at has been federalism. In Nigeria, it was seen as the way out, and some would have argued in Kenya that it was also the way out there. In Central Africa, amongst politicians in northern Rhodesia and Iceland, it was certainly not to be embraced. What you wanted to do was to disengage from federalism, which was white settler dominated from southern Rhodesia. So those are four themes which I'm sure you've got your own themes out of them, but these are the four that I jotted down, which I thought were interesting and worthy perhaps of an open further discussion. But over to the floor, and we have half an hour. So,
Mr. Chairman, we've had various remarks about the value of district administration, and I think of all organs of government in the British colonial past, district administration kept the lid on things without police, without armed services, and it also promoted central government policies in the periphery. Now the French have this in the préfet system, which is also in French colonies. We don't have this in the Westminster system. And what happened in the Solomons, independence came, district administration was scrapped. They said, we've got local government, they can perform the functions of a district commissioner. What happened? Local government was converted into provincial parliaments, which helped to confront the policies of the centre on such things as timber exploitation, preserving, replanting of timber for the future, happening in fisheries as well. And so we felt this lack in the Solomons of what had been before district administration. The French have it, we're representing the centre, the policies of central government on the periphery, and it's something the Westminster Captain does not have.
Thank you. We'll have a number of comments and then perhaps the panel. Pete.
First of all, I'd like to say that I have no doubt, although I'm of a slightly younger generation, of the tremendous work that all of you did in the colonial sort of service, having gone into Africa as they came into independence. And I think all I'm totally committed to that. What I found interesting is that in today's discussions, it's moved around a lot, but this discussion has tended to look in terms of the Westminster system, and I like the word system, certainly Commonwealth model, as being the trigger for independence. And that this was how they became independent, by adopting the Westminster system. And I found it interesting that the very fact it was a system, it seemed to me, did not take sufficient account of the role of the individual and her personality. And if one looked at the emerging independence, particularly in Africa, it was dominated by single figures. I mean, these names have been mentioned already. You have Kaunda in Zambia, you have Bandu in Malawi, Kenyatta in Kenya. And yet it seemed to me that we did very little to train or prepare these figures to become politicians. Unlike, for example, the French. And it's very interesting to contrast the decolonization process with the French. And in which